Tonight, for the first time in this referendum campaign, Labour Minister meets Labour Minister to discuss the arguments for and against Britain's continued membership of the Common Market. Roy Jenkins, Home Secretary, long-term supporter of British membership and President of the Britain in Europe campaign, and Tony Benn, Secretary of State for Industry, the man who fought for this referendum and one of the leading opponents to the Common Market. Good evening. During the next 50 minutes, an opportunity to assess, through the differing views of two Cabinet colleagues who disagree on this matter of supreme national importance, the strength of argument for and against Britain's remaining in Europe. I'd like to start, gentlemen, if I may, by asking you, since I think many people feel that the arguments for and against are very finely balanced, why it is that the two of you both feel so passionately about this issue. Mr. Benn.
Well, when all the economic and other arguments are melted away, I feel strongly about it because at bottom this erodes the importance of the vote. For people in this country who don't have money or power in industry, it is the vote that is their main safeguard for the future. And common market membership devalues and downgrades the vote because it prevents people using the ballot box to adopt policies, change men who adopt policies and thus change taxes and laws. Because in future, if people vote yes on Thursday, then whatever the outcome of the general elections may be, much real power will rest in the hands of those who will not be affected by our elections. Now, there are men who give their lives for the right to self-government, independence, democracy. There are many men in the world today in prison for those rights. And we are being invited to give up those rights for whatever purposes we shall be discussing. And I think that makes this the most important point in British political history.
Mr. Jenkins.
Well, I think that Tony Benn has outlined the position extremely well, though I don't agree with his conclusion on it. Because I think that what the issue is about is how we can best control our destiny and exercise influence in the world. And I'm very anxious that we should be able to do that in Britain, and indeed that we should increase our influence. I think it's been diminishing too fast recently. But you see, I think there's grave danger of our getting bogged down in a debate about a theoretical paper sovereignty. I know from my own experience as a minister, and I believe Tony Benn does too, long before one went into the Common Market, when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer, that one is tremendously influenced by things which happen outside this country. And I think there's a most terrible danger of believing that because Parliament carries a resolution, it can influence what goes on. What I want is to see real British power and influence and control over our destiny, and I believe we can make that more effective by cooperating rather than by staying out on our own.
What do you say?
Well, I think sovereignty is a rather mystical phrase. You see, even the powerful United States, the richest and strongest country in the world, couldn't impose its will in Southeast Asia. Nobody has power of that kind. The question is whether, in a world where you do not have total power, you have the right to decide how you respond to a situation where you are dependent upon others. Now, the Canadians, who are relatively small on the northern frontiers of the United States, if they were to adopt this argument, would have joined the United States years ago. We have struggled, and we really have struggled for centuries, to win the right to hire and fire our lawmakers. And the day we give up that right and abandon the capacity to learn by our experience through the ballot box, to dismiss a Labour government and get a new government, or a Conservative government and get a new government, the day we do that, we build in an element in our society that I believe will destroy all that is most valuable in Britain. I want to work and cooperate with everybody, but I want to govern myself And that's the key to it all.
Well, I'm glad that Tony Benn started on that by recognising what is indeed obviously the case,
Obviously.
that absolute sovereignty is a nonsense. It's a nonsense for the United States or for the Soviet Union, and it's a still greater nonsense for a medium-sized country of our size. I may say in passing, I can't think of a country less like ourselves from the point of view of its size, its economy, than Canada is at the present time. Nor, if I may say so, is there any analogy between Canada, a relatively small country, as you put it, small in population and not in size, joining the huge, rich, dominant United States, and our going into a cooperative venture with 3 countries of roughly the same size as ourselves, and 5 other countries who are very much smaller than ourselves. It's quite different proposition from this point of view. But what I want to look at this question of sovereignty from is in a practical sense and not in a theoretical sense. And I think Tony agrees with me to that extent. I mean, I don't think you are primarily interested by a mystical constitutional theory about sovereignty. I think you're interested, as I am, in how we can control our destiny and exercise influence.
Is that right, now, that you're not interested in a mystical concept?
Well, I think it's about democracy. You see, I want to cooperate and join international organizations, but no international organization of which we are members, the IMF or NATO or GATT, can make laws in Britain that we cannot change. And every colony since the war has been to London. We've had these great colonial leaders, Mr. Nehru, Mr. Nkrumah, all of them have been to London to ask for the right for self-government and independence. Now, I want no more right for the British people than we gave the Indians, than the Americans took from us 200 years ago on a similar issue.
Well, of course we must have that right, but having got that right, we must then decide what is best in our own interest to do with it. And I thought the first part of that statement was a bit theoretical, because what I'm interested in the vote, and I'm interested in democracy, certainly. But what I'm interested in is that when people elect a British government, that British government should be able to operate within a framework which gives it real power and doesn't just have it buffeted about by forces over which it has no control. And I want to apply the practical test of looking at the experience of things as they developed in the past 2 decades. The original 6 were in the community for 16 years before the 2 years in which we went in. Now, I do not find any relationship between what's happened there and the fears which you raise. I do not find, looking over this period of nearly 2 decades, that one has seen British governments masters of their fate, controlling their destinies, whereas one finds French or German governments buffeted about without influence, their leaders, men of straw, puppets of Brussels. Doesn't bear any relationship to the truth at all.
No,
the fact is that over this period, without any question, if one looks at it in hard practical terms, is that economically and politically the governments of France and Germany, take the 2 principal countries in the community, the 2 would be most like us, have gained power and influence relatively, and we've lost it. And I don't believe for a moment that you can say that elections in France or Germany have been less significant than in this country during this period, or will be so in the future.
Oh, yes. No, I think really you have skated over the issue. The people in Bristol have sent me to Parliament over 25 years, and you, I think, longer from your constituency. And every time they've had the power to dismiss me or to re-elect me, and because of that, I've had to listen to them. Now, the commissioners don't have to listen to the British people because they are immune from the possibility of electoral defeat. Now, on the continent, the traditions of democracy are different from ours. 30 years ago, Germany was under Hitler, Italy under Mussolini. France has had a succession of revolutions and counter-revolutions and coups d'etat. We, for many centuries, have fought for the right to give the ultimate power to our own people. Now, nobody can pretend, least of all you, because I know you have an idea of a political union, that's part of the European idea, can really argue that there isn't a price to be paid for this, and the price, unfortunately, is paid by the electors, whoever they elect in future elections will not be able to change the common agricultural policy, the common regional policy, because that has been adopted by a previous government and cannot be changed by a single nation, whichever government is elected.
Well, there are a lot of points there, and great interest, and I'd like to very quickly run through at least 1 or 2, if not 3 of them. I don't agree with this version that the Commission runs Europe, and the Commission is non-elected. The commissioners are appointed by the various governments of the day, But the commissioners once appointed are, on all major questions, the servants of the Council of Ministers. And the Council of Ministers are responsible to the parliaments of the different countries. Now, beyond that, I really don't like this view.
Sorry, can I just interrupt a second?
There's a very important second point, which I don't want to lose track of. Beyond that, I really don't like this view that the Germans and the French are second-class democrats. Now, it's perfectly true that they have had a less consistent history, far less, in the case of Germany in particular, of parliamentary democracy than we have. But Germany has made a great success of its democratic regime over the past 25 years, and I believe, and I don't think Tony would disagree with this, it is of fundamental importance to Europe and the world that Germany goes on making a success of that, and that France does too. And I don't want to dismiss these countries, and we can be rather complacent in this way. The fact of the matter is that we have a long tradition of political stability and political democracy, accompanied at the present time by a considerable economic weakness, accompanied at the present time by an international position less strong than we are used to and less strong than countries of similar size who in many ways have managed their affairs slightly more successfully recently. Now, I believe that in these circumstances, bringing our political tradition, which could be eroded but is still there, and amalgamating it with economic success and new dedication to political democracy. And nobody decry this, because the advantages of keeping secure democracy in Germany and keeping the old Franco-German quarrel deeply buried and replaced by a real alliance of cooperation is immensely important to all of us. I believe that by doing this, by this amalgamation of our strengths and weaknesses and their strengths and weaknesses, we can make a great deal better Europe in a better world.
We've talked now in general about sovereignty, and perhaps we'll come back to some of those points later on, because they inevitably affect every particular example of the consequences of remaining in Europe as we come to them. Can we deal with a very specific point, Mr. Benn, which you have made consistently during this campaign, and which you've been bitterly criticised for, and that is your view, stated at the beginning of the campaign, that 500,000 jobs had been lost by Britain being a member of the common market. And could you just first clarify one point, whether you still take the view that they've been lost, or whether they're imperilled, as I think you've been saying more recently?
Well, let me give the argument, because it is crucial. Roy said a moment ago, in a sense, that we must give up some of our political liberty in order to enjoy
some of our political sovereignty, which is a quite different matter. Pool our sovereignty. No question of giving up liberty at all. And please don't put words like that.
But give up the liberty to decide our policy through the ballot box in pursuit of some economic advantage. Now, before we entered the common market, we were told by Mr. Heath that it would be a bigger market. It would improve our trade with that bigger market. It would lead to a boost in investment as a result of that bigger market. It would create jobs for our people, that was his phrase, and it would benefit the regions. Now, we've had some experience of 2.5 years in, and what they show is this, and nobody has disputed the figures because they are government figures, and they are these. In 1970, because we live by manufacture, in 1970, we sold £300 million a year of our manufactured goods to the Six, more than we bought from them. In 1972, we were in balance. In 1974, they sold £700 million more of manufactured goods to us, and in the first 3 months of this year, they sold at an annual rate £937 million more than we sold to them. Now, if you take a deficit of that order of about £1 billion, an adverse deficit in trade and manufacture, and divide it among the sectors, steel and chemicals and cars and other manufactured goods, you come to a loss of jobs on a value per job of 5 or 10,000, according to how sophisticated the product, of 137,000, and if you apply the normal multiplier, which has long been used by economists and chancellors and everybody else, you come to a figure, the general depressive effect on the economy of this deficit, of the order of 500,000 jobs. Now, if you compare this with our performance in the rest of the world, you will find that far from having a billion deficit, as we've got with the common market against all the forecasts by the pro-marketeers, you have a surplus in manufactured goods of the rest of the world running in the first 3 months at nearly £4 billion a year. And what I'm saying is this, and all the evidence of our eyes confirms it in the Midlands, in Merseyside, in Scotland and elsewhere, that common market membership has been a disaster, that in the terms that I described it, 500,000 jobs have been lost if you make the comparison between trade and jobs, and that our future lies, as we've argued it does, in increasing our trade with the rest of the world. Now that is the argument, those are the facts. Nobody's attacked the figures, though there's been some argument about the interpretation of them.
Mr. Jenkins, what do you say?
Well, I'm afraid I must say that I do regard this argument as being nonsense. I will come, if I may, to exactly what I think about the facts and the conclusions from them. Have been used to dealing with balance of payments problems. I had quite an experience from 1967 to 1970 when we succeeded together, and Tony was there as an economic minister, as Minister of Technology at that stage, in turning what was then a record deficit into a record surplus. And on the basis of my experience then, which was very close and very detailed, I suppose engaged my mind almost more than anything has ever done in my life so far, I deny absolutely that the great and damaging growth in our deficit, which is certainly there, has been due to membership of the community. And how Tony can argue about the experience of the past 2 years, making no allowance apparently for the fact that during the 18 months from the end of 1973, the whole Western world, leave aside ourselves, leave aside the European community, from Japan to the United States, has been rocking on its heels as a result of the most decisive shift in the balance of world economic power which we've known for a generation at least, because of the quadrupling of oil prices, and that therefore we've had the most recession repaired throughout the whole Western world, the community or any other continent which we've known. And of course this has had a sharp effect on employment levels here. But I do not agree that this is as a result of our going in. Now, I would like to ask Tony, if I may, a number of questions on
Can I just put one question to you?
Well, you can put one question to me, certainly. But if I may put some to Tony Benn afterwards.
Absolutely, that's what you're here for, Mr. Jenkins, but I'm also here just to put the occasional question. Do you accept the principle that a deficit on balance of payments has a direct correlation with jobs in this country?
No,
I'm not talking about the EC, but just a deficit and jobs.
No, I don't, and I would find that totally impossible to reconcile with the fact that Germany, for instance, though its unemployment is now falling rapidly, has had a mammoth balance of payment surplus accompanied by higher unemployment than it's known in the past year or so. So I don't accept that theoretical position.
Thank you for clearing that up.
To begin with, so let that be absolutely clear. But I'd like to ask Tony Benn, first of all, whether he accepts the stepping up of the 500,000 to 750,000, which one of the ministers in his department did very soon after he'd done that, and how, if he believes that 750,000 jobs have been lost, or even for that matter 500,000 jobs, whether he seriously believes that had we not gone into the community, it would be the case today that if one took 750,000, we would have an unemployment rate of a little over 50,000. If one took 500,000, we would have an unemployment rate of under 300,000, both of which, the one fantastically, unbelievably lower than anything we've known since the war, and the other one of the very lowest figures we've ever had since the war, at a time when, because of worldwide recession, there has inevitably been a rise in unemployment in every country in the world. And when I may say, it's been rather exacerbated in this country recently by the very high rate of inflation. And how Tony Benn can discuss these issues of jobs and employment without any regard either to the blow to the prosperity of the Western world as a whole as a result of the oil prices, or without any regard at all to the dangerous rate of inflation in this country, I do not know.
Well, let me deal with these points one by one, because I think the first point I must repeat, which Roy didn't deal with, was that the promise of the pro-marketeers was that the wider market would increase the number of jobs, and for those who favoured market membership, this was seen as the answer to our long-term industrial decline. Now, in the event, it has got worse, and therefore all the promises made in 1971 by Mr. Heath have been shown to be false. Now, the second argument is about investment. I remember, and you will, in 1967, when we discussed it in the Cabinet at that time, that even a decision to apply, it was said, would lead to a flood of investment. We did sustain investment quite successfully when we were in power to 70 by direct methods of our own. Investment fell while Mr. Heath was Prime Minister, including the period of market membership, and the forecasts now are investment falling again. And just to deal with the figures you mentioned on investment, so serious did our present government, you and I and Dennis Healey, feel about the investment taking place on the continent as compared to this country that we took advantage.
I don't think I mentioned any figures about investment.
Well, you mentioned the Meacher figures.
I probably would.
I
mentioned a figure about jobs.
Yes, but Michael Meacher talking about investment. In 73, 500 million pounds of investment, much of it, I agree, generated on the continent, went from this country.
We are clear, we're not talking, 500 million jobs.
No, we're
500 million of investment.
We're not talking about jobs.
We're talking about investment.
Well,
I thought we were on jobs, but the two are related. Let's get it too confused.
Well, let me develop the argument, because it is an argument which is indisputable, and I notice you didn't query the figures. Investment in 73, well, the figures have not been queried. They've been published a fortnight and they haven't been queried, the interpretation you are now querying. Investment, too, has meant that German and French industry has been re-equipped when the investment in this country, only about 100 million in 73, from the 8 countries compared to 500 million generated by British firms among the 8, has also been a factor going against us. Now, all you said was, and I listened very carefully to your argument, was that it was nonsense. Well, that's a matter of opinion. And that you denied from your experience that there was this relationship between employment and trade. Yes, but if you take your own experience as Chancellor, and I recall it very well because we sat in the Cabinet together at that time, the limitation you had to face, just as Dennis Healey has to face it now, in a capacity to create jobs by reflating the economy, the limitation is the balance of payments. And the hemorrhage of a £1 billion deficit in manufactured goods with the common market countries now is one of the reasons why we cannot absorb more people back into employment. Now, of course, if you say, why hasn't unemployment risen to the full amount that my figures would suggest, the answer is very simple. Of course, we've done very well with the rest of the world. If you take the first 3 months of this year, and the figures in the Sunday papers were last year's figures, you'll find there's been a massive recovery of our trade in manufactures of the rest of the world. 43% it rose in the first 3 months. We've got a 4 billion surplus in those world markets that we believe are the future of British manufacture, and a 1 billion deficit in our trade with the continent. Now, Germany I deal with. Germany is quite a different case. I put out no figures on Germany. Germany has an industry that has had twice as much investment per head as we have. Germany's trade pattern is different. Germany has been pursuing different strategies in the economic field, and I'm not commenting on that. But nobody has been able to dispute, A, that this deficit of 1 billion represents 500,000 jobs, or secondly, if you want me to put it more positively, that if we could wipe out that trade deficit, even if we could only wipe it out in manufactured goods, it would allow us to create 500,000 more jobs in Britain. And all the evidence of our eyes in the Midlands, in the North East, in Scotland, confirms that goods from the continent are pouring into Britain and costing us jobs.
But, Mr. Benn,
very important point. Mr. Benn's been going on for some quite considerable time, quite reasonably there. May I just put a marker down by the figure, if we could wipe it out? Because I would like very much to come to the alternatives and the methods by which we might do that.
Yes.
But let us for a moment come back to the question of whether or not the figures have been challenged. Now, first of all, I should say that I do not think it is, and again I speak from close experience of figures, it is sensible to build a great conclusion on what has happened in 3 months. Figures get changed a great deal. Now, indeed, I'm not aware of any great change in our relationship with the common market which could make what has changed in the past 3 months be of decisive importance. And I think if we're going to argue, we should argue on 2 years of experience, which are 1973 and 1974. And what I do challenge, so far as the assumption is concerned, is first of all, so far as the basic figures are concerned, are that during those 2 years, in which our deficit has got greatly worse with the world as a whole, the share of the deficit accounted for by the community has declined over that 2-year period, declined from 41% to 34%. And even if one excludes oil, there's been some shift of oil to the community, and food. It is not the case that there has, over those 2 years, been a greater decline in our trading position than with the rest of the world. And I really think there is no basis.
That is not actually.
There is no basis for arguing on the basis
of
three. I'm sure it is correct. There is no basis for arguing on the basis of 3 months' experience, where figures are very liable to be corrected, where you can have very short-term trends indeed coming into effect. But what I do query, I query to that extent your basic figures. But of course I don't suggest for a moment that you take figures out of the just make up figures from the balance of trade statistics. Of course, you take those figures accurately. But I do query absolutely fundamentally the deductions which you draw from them. I think the deductions bear no relationship to reality at all. It's as though you were to say, which indeed would be the truth, that it was as cold on the Saturday before Whitsun Bank Holiday, as I think it was, a little colder maybe than on Christmas Day. Now, if you announced this, I would say certainly I agree with your figures. But if you then, which I think is more or less the equivalent to what you've done, is to say that proves decisively that because it was colder on Spring Bank Holiday than it was on Christmas Day, we must have moved into the southern hemisphere, and that we are going to swing round winters and summers, and we'd better make our dispositions on this basis in the future, then I would think that led to a very false and indeed dangerous conclusion. And I would regard your 500,000 job figure, and still more, your junior minister's addition to it of 250,000 as being in that sort of category of reasoning.
Well, can I just say one word on this, because I'm very glad...
We're about halfway through our time.
Well, I understand that.
I know you both have many points you want to make.
But you see, a joke about weather is not really right when we're talking about people's jobs, their security, their future, and so on. We're talking about jobs.
I'm not joking about jobs,
but I
you know that perfectly well.
I know, but
if you challenge me as to what extent I dispute your figures or your methodology, then I indicate that to some extent I dispute the figures, as I've indicated, and that I dispute almost wholly the methodology, and therefore the conclusion which follows from it, as indeed has done the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as indeed has done the Independent National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which is not very pro-market, and which has produced conclusions in the last week directly contrary to yours.
No, I think the figures, and this is important to establish, and you've been quite fair about it, and I'm not grumbling, the figures came from official government statistics. Now, all political argument is about interpretation. And in an election, Conservatives will say to you, our problems are due to the Labour government. They're saying it now. And you will say, no, it's due to something else. And we all do this. This is what political argument is about. But you see, we are now looking at a situation where there is a last chance vote for the British people on Thursday. And there is a lot of evidence, and if you want me to give a clear example, Scotland was in the common market with the United Kingdom over many years, and 35,000 Scots had to come south every year in search of work because of deindustrialization. There is enough evidence, and it's available to our eyes to see that the centre of British industry, or the centre of industry in the community, will move to the Ruhr, that we will lose manufacturing jobs at an accelerating rate, that our real growth market is with the rest of the world, and that this will not only affect factory workers, car workers, engineering workers, steel workers, imperial typewriters moving to Germany, singers in Glasgow moving to Germany, not only affect them, but white-collar workers, and then the pressure for cuts in public expenditure, now very strongly urged by Conservative spokesmen, means that public servants, local government officials, and others will be affected. And my argument, which I don't think has been shaken at all by our exchange, is that we face a genuine danger, of which we've already some early evidence, that our failure to compete within the common market with German and French industry, particularly as captives of French food, which we'll come to in a minute, will lead to the deindustrialization of Britain, to loss of jobs, and this will extend throughout the economy. Now, that argument, I believe, remains unaffected by the various detailed criticisms that you might have been able to make.
So I move to the question of what we do to cope, in fact, with Britain's economic position.
When I've said a word about that argument in half a sentence, which I don't accept this tremendous pull of the centre always. I mean, if you want to take one British industry, which has done outstandingly well in its exports to Europe since we went in, it's the chemical industry. And if anywhere, the chemical industry is based on Teesside, where I've been doing this campaign, maybe you have too, and found a very strong pro-market, pro-yes sentiment. And that's certainly not a central area, it's not even southeast or the Midlands, it's a northeastern area, and I don't accept this pull of the centre being always there. But what I would very much like to turn and ask you, and I put the market down, a marker down earlier, not the market, a marker, which was when you said that if we could stop these imports coming in, then we would have more jobs. I think that's a slightly doubtful assumption, but it leads very much on to what is the alternative strategy, which you propose if by chance we were to vote no and come out. Now, the alternative strategy, which is firmly put forward in the no pamphlet, which has been distributing this week, is that having ruptured our relations with the community as such, we should immediately ask them for a free trade area, rather as Norway and Sweden have with the community. And I'd like to ask if, Tony, you believe that that would be the right course to pursue.
Well, I'll answer that very simply, because you and I were members of a government over the last 10 years, Labour governments, 2 Labour governments, in fact, which in the course of that period has in 1964 introduced import surcharges. In 1968, devalued the pound,
67.
and in 67 devalued the pound, and in 1974 introduced control of capital movements to deal with this investment flood to the continent. Now, all of those 3 things are prohibited by common market membership at the end of the transitional period. Michael Foot, in his broadcast this morning, made the point, and I accept it entirely, that if we are to safeguard the jobs of the British people, we must retain the right to introduce some import surcharge, as was done in 64, the right to devalue the pound, as was done in 67, the right to control capital movements. Now, in your own position as a strong and sincere advocate of the pro-membership of the market, you are suggesting to a British industrial nation, a manufacturing nation, that we should abandon forever the power to reach those decisions. This is where democracy, sovereignty, and jobs link. And I am saying that we would do what any responsible British government of any party would do, would enter into trading arrangements with the 8 countries of the community when we withdraw, as I believe we shall, in the interests of our country. And if it worries you, after all, the common agricultural policy is based on import control. Every bit of cheap food that comes into the common market is taxed to the level of the French farmer. And I do not understand why you should be against the French farmers facing free world competition in food and having a protected market and import levies, and then say that it's shocking for us to argue only and no more that in the armoury of the defence of British working people and their jobs, we should retain that defence too. I'm saying no more than that.
Well, that raises a great number of points, some of them relevant, some of them rather less relevant.
Well, you argue that.
I hope that you do, and I'd be very willing to deal with them. But I think you can do a great deal within the common market. Now, I'll come to this in a moment. Italy has just done a good deal and has turned its balance of payments round rather sensationally. But I hope you don't think that answered my question as to whether, if we come out, you're in favour of immediately negotiating for a free trade area. Could you just answer that?
No, certainly. We should negotiate. Well, will you please allow me to answer the question?
No, if I may say so with respect, I don't think it's reasonable, because I asked you a question. You gave a very long answer without answering the question. I then re-asked the question. You've now very kindly answered the question, saying yes. But it is actually my turn to reply to you, as you had a very long answer.
You didn't let me finish my answer. I said we would negotiate a trading arrangement with the
question.
Is your answer yes or no to the question, would you be in favour of a free trade area, which is the question Mr. Jenkins
We would negotiate the best trading arrangement we could get with the common market to meet our national interests, and that is the basis on which we shall negotiate our withdrawal after what I believe to be a no vote on Thursday.
Well, I'm afraid I'm bound to regard that as a totally equivocal answer, and one which really makes nonsense of the main case which is put forward in the no pamphlet, which says firmly we will negotiate a free trade area. Now, I think this is of absolutely fundamental importance for 2 reasons. First of all, if you're going to, I think you'd have difficulty in negotiating it. Having just ruptured existing relations with the community, I think they'd be pretty sceptical as to what they did, and I think you would have a period of great uncertainty and great damage so far as exports, investment and jobs were concerned. But leave that aside. If the solution, which is advocated in the pamphlet and extremely equivocally by you, because to be honest to say we get the best arrangement we can tells us nothing at all. I mean, that is something which obviously anybody would say and is not informative. It's merely a declaration of hope and intention. But if the policy is to negotiate a free trade area, then be no doubt at all, that negates the whole of your case, that if we could keep out these imports. Because one thing you absolutely cannot do, Tony, is to go to people, particularly when you've just ruptured an existing arrangement with them, and say, now we want a new arrangement, and the basis of the new arrangement is going to be a free trade area. But there's just one thing we must say to you before you can't sign on the dotted line for the free trade area, and that is, as a matter of fact, we don't intend the free trade area to include free trade so far as your imports to us are concerned. And this really is a proposition which one cannot begin to sell to anybody. And if, therefore, you are in favour of a free trade area, which is the official position of the Antis, then all this argument about keeping out goods, even if it did save jobs, which I'm doubtful about, falls by virtue of that. Secondly, I think it's extremely serious indeed. The fact that I put it in, I hope, a good-humoured way doesn't mean it's not serious. Secondly, it would undermine a very large part of the sovereignty argument, because I think you know from your experience that, in fact, as a matter of fact, curiously, on a point of reminiscence, the greatest interference from abroad, which I ever recollect, in something we wanted to do industrial in this country, was not in this government, but in the previous Labour government, when, as a result of our membership of EFTA, we had to cut down the size of the aluminium smelter program which we were undertaking. And in fact, the members of EFTA, the free trade area members, Norway, Sweden, Austria, have to accept all the rules from Brussels. The only difference is that they have no part in forming them, whereas we inside have a voice, a powerful voice. And I am in favour of the pooling of sovereignty, but not of the giving away of sovereignty.
Well, I think, may I first of all take your points one by one? First of all, I do not for a moment anticipate we shall have difficulty in negotiating the best trading arrangement with the
But what do you mean by the best trading arrangement? Is it a free trade area or not?
The arrangement that suits us best. And I tell you why, because we are their very best customer. Can you imagine, what are the Germans to say to us, Roy? Be common sense for a bit. Are they going to threaten they won't sell us their Volkswagens? Are the French going to threaten not to sell us their butter? The Italians going to deny us the right to buy their wine? Let me deal with it now. We are the best customer of the community, and I've never heard a supplier insult its best customer. We're in a very strong position. Now, secondly, of course, we will have the right, when we've left the community, to free ourselves from being a captive market of the French uneconomic food farmers, the farmers, which will be a benefit to us, and we will have the right to invest in the recovery of our own industry, free from the control under Article 92 of the Commission. Now, what I object to very strongly, we're not being personal, but in the way this argument is presented by the pro-marketeers in this campaign, is the idea that having gone into this club on the grounds it would make us rich, we are now told 2.5 years later that we're so poor beggars can't be choosers, and therefore we can't come out. We've really got to have confidence in this country's capacity to survive with world markets, as we've always done, with the right to buy food where it's cheapest, including French food, and with the right, I'm asking for no more than the right, to do what you and I have done as colleagues in the Labour governments over 10 years, if it's necessary, to impose import surcharges, to devalue, and to control capital movements. Now, you are inviting the British people to give up 3 of the most powerful weapons that will safeguard their jobs, their security, and their future.
No, I don't agree with that at all.
Well, I didn't think you would, but there you are.
As a matter of fact, I think if you judge it right to do these things, and I'm very sceptical myself as to the extent to which import controls do, in fact, I think they are much more likely to lead you down a rather endless road of increasing uncompetitiveness rather than to cure a balance of payments problem. And I'm very sceptical of the effect to which import deposits, which we did in '68, had an effect upon the balance of payments, for instance, as opposed to credit restriction at home. But leave all that aside. I believe actually you could do all these things if you wanted to more in the community than you could in a free trade area. And you have given no real indication, no economic indication at all as to what you would do, except to say our position would be immensely powerful. We'd tell them what sort of arrangement they wanted, and they'd come begging us to do it. And I think this is, I've just finished this, I think that is a very complacent view to take indeed. We sell 34% of our exports to the community, and they sell 8% to ours. Of theirs to us. And I think the view, no doubt, we would have a certain interest in trading relations mutually, even if we came out. But the view that we are in an immensely strong position and they would come begging to us is a very complacent view indeed.
Are you saying that the government would have all the freedom it needed to control the British economy, to develop it, to strengthen it in the way that Mr. Benn feels it needs strengthening inside the market, that it can do anything it wants?
I think that in practice you can do almost anything which you want, and you can do as much as this as you can within a free trade area, accepting rules within such a free trade area.
Would there be any situation where you felt that...
I gave the specific example that the biggest restriction I've seen in practice, as opposed to rather theoretical hobgoblins which are sometimes produced, occurred when we were members of EFTA and not when we were members of the community. But of course, what is of crucial importance, and here Tony Benn and I will certainly agree, is a level of investment in British industry. And I think if you believe we've lost investment in the market, if we decided to go out, you'd see a much worse position so far as that is concerned.
But you see, the basic difficulty of your argument is that there is a price to pay in our own democratic control of our economic policy, and you are really denying that price exists. Now, I don't know what your current view on political federation is, but most of the really serious pro-marketeers, and I include you in this category over a very long period, actually believe in an economic and monetary union, in a move towards political union, in a merging of control of our economy over a much wider range of policies. Now, to suggest that entering the market will make no real difference, I think gives a lack of credibility to this argument, because I think you'd be the first to admit that an economic and monetary union, which Giscard d'Estaing indicated the other day the French and the Germans and the Benelux countries might go for, even without Britain and Italy, which he said had permanent and deep-seated economic problems, that such an economic and monetary union would deprive elected governments, and hence the voters, these are the people I care about, not ministers, they can live on their own, but the voters have got to have the right to elect a government that will do things to protect their jobs, even if it does mean some import restrictions, devaluation, or control of capital movements. And you're demobilizing the British people, I think, of these major powers, and then saying, look, it doesn't make any difference. Now, I think that's not altogether presenting the price the British people are actually being asked to pay.
I think an economic and monetary union is a long way off.
Do you believe in it?
But I take your central point.
Do you believe in it?
Do you believe it?
I think as a long-term objective, yes, it could be highly desirable. And I certainly do not take the view that there is great freedom in having a constantly depreciating pound, in getting into a position in which your imports cost more and more, in which you import inflation, not because other countries are inflating faster than you are, they're inflating far less fast. Germany is inflating at barely a quarter our rate, but that our cost of imports, because of our depreciation in pound, goes up all the time. We can increasingly hardly afford to go abroad, and therefore we get driven, if we are not very careful, into a siege economy with all its very unpleasant connotations and disadvantages so far as that is concerned. But Tony Benn, where he is absolutely right, is in saying that, of course, it is not right to pretend that I believe that being in Europe makes no difference. If I were going to pretend that, I wouldn't have fought this issue as I have fought it over the past 15 years. And of course I want to be in Europe, because I want Europe to mean something, to stand for something, to achieve something, and to be a cooperative, to be a going cooperative concern. And although I don't believe that a federal state is on the horizon, certainly not within the lifetime, even of you, Mr. Dimbleby, let alone myself or Tony Benn, I don't think a federal state probably will ever suit Europe in a strict sense of the word. I certainly want to see some political cooperation and some democratic institutions strengthened within the community. And I want to see, for instance, an approach to a common foreign policy attitude, because so far we've discussed economics almost entirely, and I think it's rather important we should discuss some politics and discuss Britain's general position in the world. And I believe increasingly that the objectives I want to see realized in world policy will all of them be aided by our being in and getting some real political unity. By that I don't mean a single state, I mean a move towards a coordination of policies within Europe. Because I want to see, European influence in the world greater. I want to see the Western alliance continue, because I think our security depends upon it. But I want to see Europe having a greater influence within it, which indeed is absolutely essential at the present time because of the weakened position of the Atlantic pillar. I want to see a tremendous effort on the part of the developed countries as a whole to aid the poor, developing, grindingly poor countries of the world. The Lomé Convention is a big advance there. And what they are now all far more interested in is the European market as a whole. and what aid they can get from Europe as a whole, Western Europe as a whole, as opposed to what they can get from us alone. And in a world in which China becomes the third of the superpowers, whether she likes it or not, I want to see not the world just settled by the superpowers as a whole, but I want to see countries like ourselves, which I think we can only do by cooperation, having an influence in accordance with the history and tradition and, I think, wisdom which we genuinely have in this country. And I think this means some political unity in Europe.
Well, it's a very, Roy has raised quite properly, because we must discuss this on the largest scale, very big questions. I begin with the siege economy, because, of course, the common agricultural policy is a siege economy for French farmers. Nobody argues that because French farmers are uncompetitive, there's overmanning and they should be laid off. If cheaper
But
food...
they've been laid off on an enormous scale.
Yes, but just, well, let me develop the
What do you
argument.
think of the number of French farmers now compared with 15 years ago?
Well, every country is losing people in the land.
But
the fact is that the French agricultural system is a protected system, and if cheaper stuff comes in from the outside, its price is raised to the level of French agriculture, and then we pay the price. Now, that doesn't happen with cars. We don't have a car mountain. As a Birmingham MP, it would be rather attractive, I would have thought, if we had a car mountain. But we don't. We have butter mountains and beef mountains because the common agricultural policy was developed to benefit the French. And if you read de Gaulle's famous veto speech, he said the common agricultural policy would be a crushing burden on the British economy. And he never thought that Mr. Heath would go on his knees and accept it. So that I just mentioned the siege economy.
We only have 3 minutes left.
Well, let me just in that case come to the point.
The international role of Europe.
I think, first of all, I think Roy has been very honest. He always has done. He does believe in a political and economic union, and he said now he favours a long-term, mid-term, an economic and monetary union.
I think it's a long way off.
Well, Giscard said it might be started soon after. Now, this is the beginning of the absorption of Britain into a federal Western Europe, not even the whole of Western Europe, a federal 9, in which we would be an offshore island province and would have lost our own power to control key decisions. Now, I do not believe the world belongs to the superpowers. America paralyzed to some extent by its internal divisions. The Russians facing revolt among the Eastern European countries. China, will it survive the death of Mao as a united state? The fact is the world belongs to those governments that stay closest to their own people. You hear so many complaints about big comprehensive schools, remote local authorities. Actually, people want decisions closer to them. And the identity and character and, above all, democratic tradition of the British people is the best we can offer to a world in
Mr. Benn, hold on a second, Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Benn, 5 years ago, you were saying exactly the opposite of that. You were arguing for Britain to be in Europe.
Well, read all your quotations which you prepared before the program. David Dimbleby.
No, but Mr. Benn, you did say this, and I'm just curious to know why you changed your view on something so fundamental as that.
But this has been quite a decent debate. I haven't quoted what Roy said about the referendum.
Well, there's nothing wrong in holding a view in 1970s.
We all know that Tony Benn is perfectly entitled.
Absolutely
has changed his mind about Europe over the past 4 to 5 years. I'd sometimes like to know why he's changed his mind and why some of his objections weren't there previously. But that's not the issue.
Well, and you have, in fairness, on the referendum.
No, I think I've been fairly consistent.
On the referendum, on the referendum, you resigned on the referendum and have accepted it, and that's
I've accepted the referendum, and I'm fighting as hard as I can to get what I believe we will get, a yes answer, which I believe was strongly in the interests of the people of this country. But in a careless way, I agree with what you were saying at the end. I think there are a lot of decisions which should be devolved downwards to more local units. But there are some which, if they are to be taken at all, have to be taken internationally and not nationally.
But none separated from democratic control, Roy.
When you pretend none separated from democratic control, therefore let's make the community, let's first of all have it with the Council of Ministers as it does, having a very effective control, and then let's make it more democratic. But if you pretend, what I think is the absolutely wrong position is that everything must be done at Westminster, nothing should be devolved to Bristol or Birmingham or street localities or whatever it is, and nothing either should be done internationally. I want some movement both ways, and I think there are a lot of decisions
but the ultimate
which, unless they are taken
must be left with the
internationally,
people.
Unless they are taken internationally, will not be taken at all. National governments will be impotent. talk of internationalism will be meaningless humbug, and I think that Britain will get into a steadily weaker position. Now, I don't believe that's necessary. I've got great confidence in this country, and I believe that this country can do just as well out of the community as the members of the community can, and can help itself and help Europe and help the world.
Very briefly.
I think that the power to govern ourselves must remain with the British people, cooperate worldwide, trade worldwide, join the United Nations, be members of international communities, but cut the umbilical cord that links the lawmakers with the people, and you destroy the stability of this country.
Internationalism in theory, but not in practice, when you've got a group of neighbours who want to work with you, of which you're part, and you're asking the British people now
to destroy
take
democracy.
A terribly disruptive decision,
to destroy
at a time of
parliamentary
great
democracy.
fragility for the British economy, and to subject themselves to great dangers in the future.
Gentlemen,
and I believe they won't do that on Thursday.
There I must stop you. Thank you both very much indeed for taking part in this discussion. There are occasions when the interviewer has to sit back and let the two protagonists discuss, and that's what I've done this evening, and I've been quite happy to, as a matter of fact. But if Mr. Benn will forgive me, I'll end by quoting him just once more, and completely non-partisanly. He wrote several years ago, "The searchlight of publicity shone on the decision-making processes of government would be the best thing that could possibly happen." Well, I hope that tonight's panorama has briefly illuminated those processes. It may be the last time it happens since after Thursday. We're assured by the Prime Minister that their freedom to argue, at any rate in public, comes to an end. Gentlemen, thank you both very much again, and good night.